I'm WHQR News Director Ben Schachman with a quick editor's note before you listen to this episode. Since we recorded and first broadcast this show, we've learned more about the issue of uncounted absentee votes. And during this episode, we discussed 1,500 mail-in ballots that did not show up on election night, but will be counted next week before the county canvass. That leaves us in limbo for close races like school board and the Board of Commissioners here in New Hanover County. We've since learned that that number is even higher, closer to 1,750. According to the Board of Elections, the initial number was a visual estimate, and the new number is a much better approximation. We've also learned that this could be a statewide issue, meaning many thousands of uncounted ballots could come into play next week when statewide totals are counted, and that could shift some major races like the Supreme Court justice seat. We'll have more information online at WHQR.org and more reporting in the coming days. All right, on with the show. From WHQR Public Media, this is The Newsroom. I'm Ben Schachman. Thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll be digging into the 2024 election results for races from around the Cape Fear region. We'll be joined by my WHQR colleagues Nikolai Mather and Kelly Knoyer to talk about Board of Commissioners and State House races from Brunswick and New Hanover County, and Rachel Keith, who will help us take stock of the school board race in New Hanover County. We'll also be joined by Johanna Still from our partners at the Assembly to dig into the expensive and contentious race between Michael Lee and David Hill for State Senate, and the less expensive but still contentious race for District Attorney. But before we can get into any of that, we need a billboard-sized asterisk and caveat. The vote totals we're talking about on today's show will not be finalized until Friday, November 15th during the canvass. Now, this is true every election, but this year it's even more important. That's because there are over 3,000 ballots left to be counted. We saw a significant increase in provisional ballots, almost 2,000 of them, which could be driven in part by the new voter ID law, which was rolled out this year. Now, not all of those provisional ballots will be approved, but many certainly will be. Then there are 1,500 mail-in ballots that were not included in Tuesday night's totals. This is a complicated situation, and we'll have links to our reporting on it on the show page, but here's the short version. Due at least in part to staffing shortages, the New Hanover County Board of Elections agreed to a cutoff date of October 31st for mail-in ballots to be included in the election night vote totals. This is super important. That does not mean those votes won't be counted. They absolutely will. But when the votes were reported on Tuesday night, they didn't include all of the legal, valid mail-in ballots that arrived between Halloween and 7:30 p.m. on Election Day. Now, those votes are slated to be counted on Thursday, November 14th. And because the 1,500 mail-in ballots are expected to favor Democratic candidates by as much as 2-1, they could alter the very close races for school board and county commissioners here in New Hanover County. There's been a lot of confusion and frustration about this situation, from journalists, candidates, the county, and the public. But I want to reiterate, officials say the votes will be counted. But for now, we are in a kind of limbo, at least for about a week. So keep that in mind as we discuss these very provisional results. All right, with that out of the way, let's get into it. Joining me now are my colleagues Nikolai Mather and Kelly Knoyer. Nikolai, Kelly, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, we can't get too much further into the show without acknowledging the weird ballot-splitting behavior that North Carolina is always known for, but that we saw like on a whole new level this election season.
Yeah, people absolutely are willing to vote for Democrats here, Republicans there. I mean, the large contingency of unaffiliated people that we have in New Hanover County, it's about a third of our voters, if not more. And we are seeing that these voters are splitting their votes across parties. They're not going just for one or the other.
So we saw the state go for Trump, but also for Democratic candidate Josh Stein, the Attorney General, who's now the governor. And we also saw candidates overall, it was close, but we did see them reject other Council of State candidates like Michelle Morrow for Superintendent of Public Instruction. And so then when we get down to the county level, we saw some interesting behavior. Nikolai, what did it look like in Brunswick County?
In Brunswick County, we saw a lot of similar crisscrossing, but almost on like another level. across the board, Republican candidates still swept the board. But what was really interesting to me is they won by a lot less, these county commission candidates in Brunswick County. When I was checking the numbers for specifically Mike Forte, who is an incumbent Republican in Brunswick County, who ran for county commission again, he ended up only winning certain precincts by about 52% of the vote. In the precinct for Navassa and for Brunswick Forest, Mike Forte only captured about 51% of the vote. That is incredibly close for a district that is pretty reliably Republican for everything else, essentially. Calabash, Southport, and even Bald Head Island came down to 53% support for Republican county commissioners. And mind you, these communities in southern Brunswick County, they went hard for State Representative Charlie Miller. He captured around 60% of the vote in those precincts. It goes to show a growing interest, I think, among Brunswick Republicans towards crossing lines for local elections.
Absolutely, and we know a lot of that is driven by frustration with development. If you're a sitting official, you're kind of a sitting duck for anti-development sentiment.
Absolutely. Now, that didn't really work out for all three incumbent Republican county commissioners. I think that the strongest showing of support for any of the incumbents was for Pat Sykes. She had the strongest lead out of the incumbents this year in those coastal communities, but Navassa and Brunswick Forest actually showed out for her this year. She ended up taking closer to 60% of the vote in those precincts, whereas Mike Forte and Frank Williams, who I think have seen a lot of anger over their stances on development, had much, much closer races.
Yeah, so with the caveat that we heard earlier in the show that New Hanover County is kind of a guessing game right now because we've got several thousand ballots sort of in the mix, and we're waiting to see how they turn out. I do want to talk a little bit about New Hanover County's commissioner race.
Yes, absolutely. So what I will say about that is we did see some splitting here. As far as the preliminary results go, which we are short at least 1,500 ballots for, so it's a little bit hard to say. We did see that we had our two Republican incumbents at the top of the ticket, Bill Rivenbark and Dane Scalise. And then, oddly enough, Jonathan Barfield, the other incumbent, got knocked off by another Democrat, by Stephanie Walker. Now, she has some name recognition because she is a former school board member, current school board member. But it was surprising to see Jonathan Barfield kind of get knocked off. You typically will see either incumbents doing really well or maybe one party or the other. So having this be the switcheroo was a little bit unexpected. But like we said, these are preliminary results. It could be that we actually see Dane Scalise get knocked off and have Stephanie Walker and Jonathan Barfield in, or maybe Jonathan Barfield beats out Stephanie Walker and we see all the incumbents sweep. The number of ballots that are still uncounted make any of these options possible.
Yeah, and I will say real quick, it is just interesting. This is the second election in a row where Bill Rivenbark has been the top vote getter. He, again, did not spend a lot of money. I mean, Dane Scalise spent, we know, at least $200,000, probably more. Very well done campaign. And Bill Rivenbark did not do anywhere near that level of campaigning, but there he is at the top of the ballot, at least for now. You have to just credit some of that to the power of that last name.
Yeah, I mean, Rivenbark is basically New Hanover County political royalty with Charlie Rivenbark on city council. This is a long-known name, and so I think that's been a big benefit for him.
As we see more mail-in ballots come in, as we see the county canvass coming up on November the 15th, it's very likely that some of these results may end up changing. And I don't know. I'm very interested to see how that's going to be reflected both in Brunswick and in New Hanover County.
I know we'll have more with our colleague Johanna Still about the state senate race here in New Hanover County and the district attorney's race, but I want to talk about some of the House races because these are pretty interesting. We have some pretty well-entrenched Republican candidates with the exception of Deb Butler. But as far as Davis versus Berger.
Ooh, I mean, that one looks like an absolute blowout. Ted Davis had more than 10 points more than Jonathan Berger. I don't think that the few missing ballots that we've been talking about, or they're not going to make even close to a dent in this. It's 55.9% to 44%. So it's a pretty rough one for Berger. And this has been a much more competitive district in the past. I'm not sure if it's because the lines have changed or if it was just a really tough race for Berger for other reasons. I'd be interested in your analysis on that one.
Well, I think Davis does have a ton of name recognition in Hanover County. He was a county commissioner. He's been a state rep for some time. His district does seem to favor Republicans a little bit, but the power of incumbency is really what's going on there. But I will say 2 years ago when Amy Block-Deloche ran against him, I think she made more of a dent in the campaign. than this year.
Again, name recognition. The block name, very well known in this region, and so sometimes that's the main thing that seems to matter.
Yeah, let's talk about some of the Brunswick County races, or maybe the weirdest race for me, just like geographically, which is Charlie Miller's district, which covers the southern part of New Hanover County and Pleasure Island, and then parts of Brunswick County. So to tour this whole county, you got to start in like Curie Beach and then drive all the way north through Wilmington, go over the bridge, and then come back down through Brunswick.
Oh my God, those people desperately need a bridge. It is so funky and strange. There's really not much to write home about, though, with that specific district. Charlie Miller ran against Jill Brown to represent 19, aka Lower Brunswick, and he captured 65% of the votes. I will say, though, the Upper Brunswick portion, the very spicy face-off between incumbent Frank Eiler and political newcomer Charles Jones, that came to a close, and the numbers are pretty much as expected. Eiler did win over Charles Jones. He's been representing that district for quite some time. But again, the precincts look very interesting. As I mentioned before, one precinct went blue for Jones. That community gave him 60% of the vote. And the race was also pretty close in places like Navassa, which is a historically black community, and Brunswick Forest, which has been purpling for quite some time. Around those places, Eiler only captured about 53% of the vote. It's also interesting because this isn't as blue as it could be in Brunswick County, as historically over the past couple years it has been. You might recall that the Navassa precinct went blue for Tom Simmons when he ran against Eiler back in 2020. This year, Tom Simmons ran against Mike Forte, but I just wanted to clarify that because I know it's confusing. Those precincts were also extraordinarily close when Eric Terashima ran in 2022. They were only separated by about a percentage point. Terashima also carried Jones's precinct in Bolivia by a much wider margin that year, 64% to Eiler's 36%, and he nabbed a precinct in Supply as well that year. So it could be bluer. It wasn't this year, but it was still interesting to see some precincts flip or come very, very close. I also wanted to take a quick minute to make a note about Pender County, if that's
yes,
okay.
Yes, please, because Pender County, this was surprising to me, and give me some insight here if you can, is that in Brunswick County we saw, although Robinson didn't do as poorly as I might have thought, definitely Stein took Brunswick County like definitively, but that wasn't the case in Pender County.
No, they were all in for Mark Robinson. Well, I should say also there's not much to write home about as well for the House race in Pender County. It was Carson Smith who, talk about name recognition. I mean, he was the former sheriff of Pender County, and he's been representing that district for a little while now. Him versus Francis Lakey, who is a political newcomer. He captured 69% of the vote. So, and also same precincts that went blue for Debbie Fintak in 2020, which was the last time Smith had a challenger in this race. They went blue for Lakey again. This time maybe at a slightly higher margin, but again, basically same thing that happened in 2020. But yeah, Pender County was down for Robinson in a way that was actually kind of surprising for me, because the sense that I got when I was visiting the polls in Pender County, there weren't really that many people who were interested in Robinson. You more often saw people campaigning for Trump or campaigning for the individual county commissioners. But I also want to make one quick note, too, with Brunswick County. This is the first time in 20 years that a Democrat candidate for governor has won that county. The last time that happened was in 2004. So I was pretty shocked to see that Josh Stein got 48% of the vote in a very, very deep red county.
On the whole here, I think the results we saw kind of dispelled this idea that, negative or positive attitudes to Trump and Robinson would kind of organize things all the way down the ballot.
I think that's worth pointing out. So New Hanover County was a particularly interesting county, I think. It's very purple. Kamala Harris barely won this county. It's by less than half a percentage. But that is not the case down ballot. What we're seeing is it's crisscrossing all over the place. New Hanover County voters went for David Rouser by 4 points, more or less. We saw them go really hard for Josh Stein by 59% of voters voted for him. And then we see down ballot, it's kind of crisscrossing all over the place. We have Democrat Jeff Jackson blowing it out of the water. And then we have Mike Causey winning here as a Republican in the Council of State. So we're seeing that all down ballot, people are picking and choosing candidates based on what they're seeing in their news, based on whether they've heard that name before, based on all kinds of different things. And I think Stein had some advantages as well that we must bring up with competing against Mark Robinson, who's seen so much bad press this election cycle.
Okay, yeah, we're just going to make a quick detour here and talk about the elephant in the room just real quick. If somehow you missed reporting from the Assembly and then from CNN, Robinson has faced a host of troubling allegations, both about his past behavior as a consumer of pornographic material, and then about comments he made on a pornographic website, including the headline, quote, "I am a black Nazi." Now, to be
Allegedly.
fair, I want to say, allegedly, a magical cloak of allegedly over all of this. But I do want to say Robinson has rejected these claims, and he's in the process of suing CNN. It will be some time before we know how that defamation suit works out. But I've also talked to plenty of Robinson supporters, especially at the Trump rally here in Wilmington we had earlier this year, where people just straight up said that was fake news. They didn't believe it. They thought CNN was out to get him, or that someone had used AI to manipulate, which is not really a thing, but people were more than willing to give Robinson the benefit of the doubt when I spoke with him. But again, that's why anecdotes aren't data, because the data shows that people really backed away from him.
Absolutely. But also the anecdotes demonstrate that as well. I mean, my neighbor, I live in downtown Wilmington, and my neighbor, Miss Jackie, shout out Miss Jackie, was talking to me about how, as a Democrat, she would go into her job at the hair salon and she would talk to her largely Republican clientele. And they were still super pro-Trump, super pro-Rouser, super pro every single Republican candidate. But her conversations with them about Josh Stein really softened them to the idea of not voting for Mark Robinson. She told me that she talked to like 4 or 5 people who, after their conversations, was like, yeah, I'm going to vote for Josh Stein, which I think is fascinating.
Maybe this will be the year where we finally stop trusting the polls and stop basing our guesses just on party registration, because clearly that's not a skeleton key. That is not the master key to how people are going to vote.
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking when I was getting ready to cover this race in Brunswick County, because so many people on both sides of the political aisle or on no side of the political aisle were coming to me saying, party affiliation is not going to determine the outcome of this race. Early voting results showing the party affiliation of like this person being a Republican, this person being a Democrat, this person being unaffiliated, that is not going to show us what is going to happen with the county commission specifically. Now, they still won by a very large margin, but the general tenor that I was hearing from people in Brunswick County was, I'm going to vote Republican for everything except county commission. I don't know what I'm going to do with county commission. I was very intrigued to see that the single independent, unaffiliated candidate on the ballot, Bob Fulton, got the least amount of votes out of everybody who contested or who ran against the Republicans for county commission. Because my thinking was like, people online were saying, I don't want to vote for a Democrat, but I also don't want to vote for a Republican candidate for county commission. My thinking was like, oh, then you would definitely check Bob Fulton's name, right? But like I said, Pat Sykes seems to be the most popular out of the 3 incumbents right now in Brunswick County, so maybe they felt more comfortable voting for her.
I've had this conversation with many prospective candidates who've been looking to get into the race, who had either sort of centrist views or an eclectic range of political views and have thought about going in as an independent candidate. It is tough. It is really tough without the party machine. So that's part of the equation, I think.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that just about wraps up this segment. Closing thoughts, Kelly, Nikolai?
I can't wait to find out who actually won this election. We're not going to find out for New Hanover County until next week, and I'm eagerly awaiting finding out who we're going to be covering on the school board, on county commission for the next several years.
We as journalists want to know. I'm sure you as listeners at home want to know, or in your car want to know. I'm sure the candidates want to know. All right, Nikolai, final thoughts.
My final thoughts is I'm going to offer a free tip to anybody who is working in journalism on a state level, on a national level, on just a southern region level. Pay attention to Brunswick County, because this county is honestly one of the most interesting areas to be watching local politics right now. The politics there is going through an insane level of transformation. If you are paying attention, if you want to know more about like the general state of affairs in North Carolina, go check out Brunswick County.
Brunswick County, Laboratory of Democracy.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, Nikolai Mather, Kelly Kinnear, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
All right, well, we need to take a quick break, but we'll be back in just a moment with Johanna Still from the Assembly to talk about State Senate District 7 and the District Attorney's race. You're listening to The Newsroom. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Newsroom. I'm Ben Schockman. Thanks for staying with us. Joining me now is Johanna Still, Wilmington editor for The Assembly and my partner in crime in our weekly newsletter, The Dive. She's here to help us unpack the State Senate District 7 race and the District Attorney's race. Johanna, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to unpack a little bit the Senate District 7 race between incumbent Republican Michael Lee and Democrat David Hill. I feel like we've been here before. But let's get into this. First of all, I want to talk about just how expensive this race was.
Right. So this race is it's a seat that's traditionally been pretty competitive, right? And it's the most expensive local race. Both parties, so these are just the party machines I'm talking about, not talking about outside funding. They raised over $3 million for this particular race. Now, Lee's team, the Republicans on the Senate side, they identified his seat as being one of the three most competitive races on the NC Senate side, and they poured the most money of those three seats that were highly competitive into Lee. On the Democratic side, they had identified 5 seats that they really wanted. Hill, of course, was one of them. They poured the second most into Hill, which was about $1 million. And now all this money sloshing around, of course, translates into ads,
yes,
which were unavoidable.
Yeah, I mean, I think every time I went to the mailbox, every time I turned on cable TV news, which is pretty rare, but every single time I did, billboards, yeah, you could not escape this stuff. And we don't have to go all the way down this rabbit hole, but they got pretty contentious.
There was a lot of mudslinging, I think we can safely say.
Which is not new to this district.
No, but in terms of all the races that you're exposed to around here, I would definitely put it up there with the next race we're going to talk about, the DA's race.
Yeah, put a pin in that.
There were some harsh messages going back and forth, stuff that you'd see maybe, your TV's going on in the background and you hear it and you're like, what?
Yeah, and one of the things that struck me as potentially ironic about how heated some of this campaign material was is that back in 2022, Marsha Morgan, who was the Democratic challenger that year, ran some pretty ruthless attack ads against Michael Lee. And those ads were kind of tapping into complaints that have been lobbied against Lee over the years because in his personal life, he is a real estate attorney and he'd represented some really large developments here in Wilmington. And the ads basically implied quite strongly that he had been involved in corruption, that he had been involved in influence peddling based on his role as a state senator. And Lee took a lot of offense to this, both personally and professionally. He took Morgan to court. We never saw a judge rule on that because they settled out of court. But Morgan did end up making a public apology. She did kind of blame her campaign managers at the state level for leading her astray. But that race did get nasty.
This kind of dynamic came back up for the Hill and Lee race. Of course, the attack ads on Hill, they called him a quack liberal. He's a physician. He took the quack label and, of course, a duck quacking sound on the ads to imply that he was a quack doctor. And I ran into Hill at the polls on Tuesday. He told me there's no other way you could have interpreted that word. Like, the reason for that is to imply, and to impugn on my professional reputation, which was, which he thought was a little ironic because that's exactly what Lee had, tried to sue Marsha Morgan over, the same thing, basically, that her ads had crossed a line into his professional, front yard. And what Hill kind of explained to me, I asked him why, they wrote a letter to Lee saying, take these ads down. Lee's team went back and was like, no, we're not. They kept running the ads. So I asked Hill, I said, why didn't you fight more? Why didn't you keep going? You never continued the fight. And he basically explained to me that political speech is really protected. You can basically lie, is what he said. You can basically lie, and it's okay. Where the line is legally is the professional reputation aspect. And so that's where both of them in these two different cases had lawyers involved and were, trying to at least get some influence to stop going. Now, he didn't continue on, but, he pointed out the similarities to me.
I can say this race tends to bring out the worst in candidates, at least in the form of campaign ads. There's actually, if you go back to 2016, there's reporting about Michael Lee when he ran against Andrew Barnhill. It's a former Star News reporter, Tim Buckland, who now works for the county, wrote an article that was basically like, hey, these are two really nice guys who just became absolutely feral animals during this race. So Senate District 7 used to be Senate District 9, I believe. But this race really is always tough and usually kind of nasty and always expensive. What's different this year was that it wasn't that close.
Right. Just to finish up that point, Lee, on election night, I talked to him. He didn't think that this year was any nastier than any of the other ones. He was sort of like, it's a little bit par for the course. It's kind of, this is what happens when you have so much interest in a race like this. But yeah, you're right. His margin of victory was much bigger this year. He had an 8-point lead, much more than I think what the parties had expected to see. Maybe he benefited from some of the overall, Republican advantage. Obviously, Trump took North Carolina, but our state and county we are kind of a mixed bag, right? There's some randomness to, or perhaps, discernment. I'm not sure. I actually interviewed Aaron King, who's a political professor, to talk about why we happen to pick different parties for these different roles. It's not straight ticket, right? And so there's this sort of battle going on in New Hanover County where you have the sort of municipal core leaning much more obviously blue. You have the outskirts leaning much more red. But I'm not sure exactly what went on. Perhaps some of these, ads came into play, but Lee's lead grew by much more than in the past races where things have just been much more close, much more white knuckling.
Yeah, so it was like less than 0.5% in 2018, about 1 percentage point in 2020, about 2 percentage points in 2022.
Right, and I'll bring up one point that we had in our piece, which is I talked to the director of Carolina Forward. It's this left-leaning think tank, and he said Lee would be toast without the gerrymander, and that's the Wilmington Notch. We've talked about this. It's basically this carve-out of this area of downtown Wilmington. So those voters are in Senator Bill Rabin's district. That's that's Brunswick and Columbus counties, super red. And so effectively, those 10,000 votes are sort of thrown away. That's the process of disenfranchisement.
Yeah, Rabin did not struggle in his race against Democrat challenger Katie Randall.
Yeah, it was a landslide. And so the idea is basically if those voters, if it was a pure, New Hanover County district for Senator Lee, that it would be much more competitive. And, theoretically, if all those voters had voted for Dr. Hill, it wouldn't necessarily break down exactly like that. But theoretically, if they did, Hill would have had a 200-plus vote lead. Still crazy close in the recount margin, but it goes to show that it's a very competitive district. Now, I asked Lee about gerrymandering when I talked to him on Tuesday night. He said, despite that, it's a really close race. No matter what, it's going to continue to be super close.
I think he's right about that. And I do think if you took the northern part of the county where there's been carve-outs for this Senate district in the past and put that over into Brunswick and Columbus County, it might have been a more even mix. I still think Lee would have eked it out, but it would have been closer for sure. But let's move now to the district attorney's race, a race that was also not close.
So let's give some foundation for anybody who might have missed the local reporting and on this race. So this race, the outcome of this race had obviously it's going to be consequential, but it had a bigger, weight to it this year because of the dynamics of the district attorney's office right now and the prosecutors who work there. What were the stakes this time and why was it so different?
Right. So we got it back all the way up to 2004. So I know some of you listening weren't here then, but in 2004, Ben David fought his way through a tough primary and a race against Jen Harjo, who's now the chief public defender. That was the last time Ben David was really challenged in office. For 20 years, Ben David was the uncontested king of the district attorney's office for New Hanover County and Pender. And there are plenty of reasons to critique someone who's in office for that long just because it seems undemocratic, but it did allow the office to kind of insulate itself from partisan politics until Ben David decided he was going to resign.
Right. He says he retired. He moved on. He now has a new role that he
retired.
Created. I mean, he created this new job for himself. It's an endowment-funded community justice system. It puts together like all of his ideas he's ever had. It's kind of this very interesting experiment, which I'm sure we'll be reporting on in the future. But yes, so his retirement created a temporary vacancy for who's going to be in charge. Now, he retired after two of his employees, his subordinates, assistant district attorneys, had announced that they were going to be running for office. Obviously, he had announced early on, he was like, somebody has to fill this role. He encouraged people to step up. Obviously, there's some internal conversations that are happening in the background, but the void and the vacancy of David created the big tension here. So what went down and why was it so controversial?
So Ben David announced he would be leaving the office last year. And early in the year, it became clear that Jason Smith, a longtime prosecutor who's been essentially running the Pender County office, was kind of the collective choice of prosecutors. We've heard that they kind of did a straw poll and said, is anyone else going to run? Initially, it looked like Jason Smith was the only one on the field. Later, Rebecca Zimmer Donaldson, who is part of the wealthy and well-established Zimmer family, decided she was also going to run. So Smith is running as a Republican candidate. Zimmer Donaldson's running as a Democratic candidate, but politics don't quite work on the ideological spectrum in the office. When we had them both in here for an interview, they gave near identical answers to questions about policy, how they would run the office, how they felt about things like specialty courts, like drug court, safe baby court. They felt the same about plea bargains. And they both said Ben David was effectively the best boss they'd ever had.
Yep.
Very, very little daylight in public. In private, we had heard that Jason Smith had been criticizing Zimmer Donaldson's lack of experience. This was at a GOP event earlier in the spring. And the tenor of all of this changed after Ben officially left the office. So all of this is happening. Ben's still technically Jason and Rebecca's boss.
Right. And Democratic Governor Roy Cooper legally had to fill the vacancy once David retired. And so he chose Democrat Zimmer Donaldson. And that set off what turned into a very uncomfortable couple-month period for the prosecutors in that office. The moment that you had pointed out earlier when Jason Smith at that event had effectively, said some negative things about Zimmer Donaldson, that's really what set off this next chain of events, which is where she really came out strong with some ads.
Yeah, and this is, so Ben David has left, and Cooper appoints Zimmer Donaldson as the interim DA, so all the way through the end of the calendar year, she is now the DA. As you wrote in the dive, Jason Smith is now campaigning against his boss for her job.
Yep.
And then Zimmer Donaldson's campaign came out with a series of very negative attack ads on Jason Smith. And we don't have to unpack all of them, but they were incredibly loaded with controversial content. They drilled down on one particular case that involved an undocumented migrant who was charged with sexually assaulting a child and accused Jason Smith of going light on this defendant, knowing that Smith was not going to be able to really be public about his conversations with the victim, and victim testimony is a huge part of prosecuting these cases, which you could say, look, it's fair play. As we were saying earlier, political speech, very well protected. You can say almost anything you want in a campaign ad.
Right.
But because the DA's office had been, like I said, protected from partisan politics for so long, and because this really put Smith in a position where he was forced to either just take the hits and keep on going, or break sort of not a legal rule, but kind of an ethical and personal rule about discussing very intimate details of a rape case.
Right.
Smith objected to it. Ben David told us that he would come off the bench. He'd tried to stay sort of neutral, but he came off the bench to defend Jason, and even went so far as to acknowledge some of Smith's critiques of Zimmer Donaldson, like that she hadn't really taken the lead on a murder case, that she had been second chair, that she had had a lot of help, that she had less time in the office. And at this point, you got to remember, Smith and Zimmer Donaldson are still working together. Smith is still working for Zimmer Donaldson. That accelerated the decay of morale in the office to the point where 15 of the 16 main prosecutors basically came forward and said, you've got to stop this.
And that was just within days of those ads airing. This was quick.
This was quick. And I'll note that we got a lot of anonymous emails after that reporting ran, talking about how much worse it was than we had reported. Some were a little disappointed that we didn't go deeper on the story. But the threats/promises that prosecutors would leave the office if Zimmer Donaldson didn't stop this, at the very least represented to us the fact that there was some dysfunction and real morale issues in the race. And we honestly did not know what would happen on Tuesday.
Right.
If Zimmer Donaldson won, were we going to be looking at a full-on walkout at the prosecutors?
I mean, which brings up the really, just in terms of having a functioning civil society locally, not that, we're certainly not saying that under Rebecca Zimmer Donaldson she couldn't have, got it together, but what you're hearing from the employees of her office, from the prosecutors, is that they're already down, I think 3 or 4 prosecutors, so they're already man down. You have the majority of the office actively campaigning against their current boss, out there wearing shirts, posting on Facebook, and the potential, right, like you said, for a threat for a walkout. So, if something happens to you in New Hanover County and you need a prosecutor to go after the bad guy, and you have half the office saying that they're not even going to work, they're not going to come to work tomorrow. So this election was the potential for the actual breakdown of a public office. So that's what was really different this year.
Yeah, and I will say, to give the flip side of this, I understand the point of view of the Zimmer Donaldson campaign, which is that Because so much of what happens in the prosecutor's office happens in a black box. It happens in closed meetings. It happens in chambers. It's, with cases involving juveniles, a lot of that is not public record. And it is difficult for even journalists who are trained to follow these cases and report on them to really get total clarity and insight into how the DA's office is working. For the layperson, it's completely opaque.
Totally.
And the frustration of how do you run as a prosecutor, an election campaign against another prosecutor when it is so difficult to bring any kind of track record or sense of how the office is working or not working to light. I do get that frustration. I also think that some of the reaction from the prosecutors came not because this was a violation of the law or totally immoral, but because they had never seen this. In 20 years, their office has been completely safe. I know there are DA's offices that have had much higher turnover, but in our little burg, the sheriff's office and the DA's office have been very stable for a long time with one person in power, and that has insulated them from the kind of partisan rancor that we see in every other office. And so for the Zimmer-Donaldson campaign to kind of suggest, hey, all's fair in love and war and politics, that is an attitude that we wouldn't even blink at in any other race. We certainly wouldn't blink at it in Senate District 7.
Right.
But in the DA's office, it hit different. Now, much of that seems to be resolved. Results of Tuesday, of course, are preliminary. New Hanover County, Smith and Zimmer-Donaldson pretty much neck and neck. Zimmer-Donaldson a little bit ahead. But in Pender County, Smith picked up 12-some thousand votes. We've talked earlier about how there's a lot of provisional and absentee ballots waiting in the wings. Not enough to change that.
Of course, with Smith being the presumptive winner, things are healing in the office.
That is Smith's point of view. It's what we've heard from some of the other prosecutors who've spoken with us. For what it's worth, Zimmer-Donaldson had said she will finish out her term as interim DA that runs through the end of December. But after that, she said, quite bluntly, I will not work for Jason Smith.
Well, there you have it.
All right, Johanna Still from the Assembly, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ben.
All right, well, we need to take one more quick break. But when we come back, I'll sit down with my colleague Rachel Keith to unpack what we know about the New Hanover County Board of Education race. You're listening to The Newsroom. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Newsroom. I'm Ben Schockman. Thanks for staying with us. Joining me now is my colleague, Rachel Keith, who has covered the New Hanover County Board of Education for a long time, so she knows all the players, and she's been covering this campaign season, so she knows the newcomers as well. She's here to help us unpack what we know tentatively about the election results. Rachel, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So before we get into this, we should give the requisite caveat that what we're about to discuss is colored a little bit by some outstanding ballots.
We announced that the top three winners for the New Hanover County School Board, where the top vote getter was Judy Justice, followed by Tim Merrick, followed by, and those are two Democrats, followed by Republican David Perry. However, trailing Perry is pretty closely is Democrat Jerry Jones. So what will these new ballots say? Will it change the outcome of this election? After Jerry Jones, it's Republican Nikki Bascom and then Republican Natasha Tu.
Yeah, and again, what we know about these ballots is that they tend to break in favor of Democrats. That's not a hard and fast scientific rule. There is a world in which these ballots are almost entirely Republican, and Natasha Tu could take the third place spot, but statistically and historically, that's very unlikely. But all of this just to remind you that this stuff is tentative, and we will have to wait until next week. But the ballots that are outstanding here in New Hanover County probably won't change the state race, given the margin there. So let's talk a little bit about this. This is the race for Superintendent of Public Instruction.
Yes, we have Democrat Mo Green beat Michelle Morrow, who's a Republican. And that, is germane for the local school board. They look to the state superintendent for guidance, and they lead public schools for the entire state. And so they kind of set the tone. And if you look at overall in the state, Mo Green won 51% to Morrow's 49%. And then in New Hanover County, it gets wider, that Mo Green won 53% of the vote in New Hanover to Michelle Morrow's 47%.
And we should note that this is usually kind of a sleepier race. You wouldn't usually hear about the North Carolina Superintendent of Public Instruction race on national NPR. But you did this year, both because it got a lot more fundraising around it, And also there were some comments made in the past on social media by Morrow that were really troubling to some voters, even conservative voters in places like Brunswick County, which traditionally very red county, that didn't go for her. So it was an interesting race. And again, this is something we have asked our local candidates about because the interplay between local school boards and the state is really important.
Yeah, I mean, the state gives them guidance on so many things, curriculum, policy making. The State School Boards Association, looks to NCDPI to make policy. So it's a really important role for them to pay attention to and for the public to as well, if you're interested in following public education.
So, all right, here in New Hanover County, preliminary top vote getter, Judy Justice, who most people who followed your reporting will remember was on the board from 2018 to 2022. She ran in 2022, lost that race, but is back this year to try and reclaim her seat. It looks like she's been successful. She was the top vote getter.
And of course, their top priorities are hiring the next superintendent. The board fired Dr. Charles Faust in July, so it's been an ongoing discussion of who's going to be next. And interestingly enough, the board right now is split 5-2, Republicans to Democrats, and they're starting to agree that interim superintendent Dr. Christopher Barnes is doing a good job, and that's across partisan lines. But we have the new member saying, hey, I want to maybe do a search, and this is what Judy said about that.
But what we need to do is focus on the most professional way about going about this, in my opinion, from having been through it before. Yeah, I know there's a lot of people that are calling for, Chris Barnes to just stay in the position he's in. He's doing a good job, but the thing is, he's not experienced. And after everything we've been through, I really think we need to do this right. Look at all options. That's one of the major, if not the major thing we need to look at. And the budget right now, definitely start looking at it now. Start talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, you have her saying he's doing a good job. I'm hearing that, but maybe we want someone who's an established superintendent that's had many years, and we'll have to see how this goes forward. But the new candidates, top of mind, it's going to be voting for the next chair, vice chair, picking the superintendent, and starting on this budget process.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say real quick that Judy Justice is known for being incredibly outspoken on the board during her 4-year tenure from 2018 to 2022. We've seen that be both a benefit and a detriment in some cases. We've heard from voters who just didn't like how brash she could be, and at sometimes she would derail conversations because she wanted to get her point across. On the other hand, we've heard from people who feel like she is just very passionate about the issues. It remains to be seen how she will interact with other very strong-willed board members on the current board. So that, I think, just anecdotally out in the street, people have said, I cannot wait to hear debates between, for example, Pat Bradford and Judy Justice. So if the vote totals hold the way they are, that is something we will see.
That's what we'll see. And behind, we mentioned Judy, is Tim Merrick. He is a retired chiropractor, and I go to all these board meetings, and he's been a regular at these board meetings for the past 2 years. And I actually ran into him when I was doing my reporting on the polls at CFCC. He was there electioneering for votes. And I just said, hey, if you win, what's top of mind for you? And this is what he said on November 5th.
Budget is always going to be the thing, because everything I'm worried about, overcrowded classrooms, underfunded schools, teachers that are leaving, safety issues, it all boils down to budget at some point. And I was terribly disappointed when our school board wouldn't even ask for the full amount that we needed to balance our budget this year. And we lost a lot of teachers because of it, something we just can't afford to do.
So just for context, what Tim Merrick is talking about here is that school boards don't have the authority to fund themselves. There's not a school board tax, but they do prepare a budget. It's basically an ask of the county, and there was basically 2 competing models. One had minority support, one had majority support. There was one model that would have asked for millions of dollars more, that would have fully funded most of the teacher positions they wanted to save after facing the budget shortfall that you reported on so much, Rachel. There was another budget that was more modest, that seemed more in line with what the county commissioners seemed inclined to be honest. It was a politically safer ask, but I think a lot of people in the public were disappointed.
Yes, and I mean, you had Hugh McManus, and he'll be off the board in December, and Stephanie Walker. It looks like she will get a seat on the commission. We will see because of these ballots. But they said we need to ask for the full amount. I mean, eventually they went with what they could handle, but those were the two that were saying we need to ask for the full amount, and that's what Tim said. So it looks like they're going to be advocating for what they need. But then again, you have to work with 6 other members to decide what the ask will be. And the 4 Republican members, they have the votes to do the ask that they want to do. But we'll see if there's going to be more consensus on that point. We'll see.
Right, and there's also the risk of being seen as publicly not asking for enough, not standing up for teachers, as some people have framed it. So that could have some political consequences because the 4 Republicans who are still on the board will, of course, face re-election in 2 years if they want to stay on.
Yeah, and they did have to do those cuts. I mean, they had to do them
Which was
because
painful,
they didn't
yeah.
have the money. Yeah.
I will also say I saw Merrick out at the polls every time I went out. Whatever you think of his politics or his policies, he definitely put in a lot of effort. He was out in the community quite a bit. I think it's fair to say that probably contributed to his success because he is a newcomer to politics with not a lot of name recognition. And I had a couple conversations with him, and he, like Judy, as an outsider, it looked like Chris Barnes was doing a great job, but he wants to do a full professional search. I think there is some concern that, yes, they are without a permanent superintendent. That's a difficult situation. That kind of puts you in a tough position when you're trying to get ready for the budget cycle. But he doesn't want to see that pressure force them to make a snap decision.
That's right. And what I've been hearing as well is that, hey, Chris Barnes was here for this budget discussion last year, and if we throw someone, he knows now what to do. But if we throw someone new in there, is that going to derail the process too? So there are pros and cons to having a new person with fresh eyes. Maybe they're a budget whiz. Or well, Chris Barnes, he went through the fire last year and he wants to get started early. So we'll see how they make that decision.
So moving on, we had David Perry. Again, preliminary vote results show he is in 3rd place. That's the 3rd seat. Perry, some people may recognize, he ran as a Libertarian candidate for State House, where he challenged Charlie Miller. And he's been openly critical of Republican and Democratic candidates in the past from sort of that third-party position. He is now firmly in the Republican Party, although I have seen him on social media disagree with select decisions made by the Republican majority, usually on constitutional grounds. The
professional standards of speech, he weighed in on that.
Yeah, and so he actually spoke to our mutual colleague, Leah McConnell, when she saw him at the watch party on election night where the Republican candidates were watching the poll numbers roll in. And he said he really wants to focus on teacher pay and helping teachers not wear too many hats, as he put it. I think this is something we've heard a lot from conservative candidates. They feel that teachers are being pulled away from their teaching duties by quote-unquote woke indoctrination or stuff like that. But I think more generally, I think his message does actually resonate a little bit because we hear from teachers that they're being asked to do so much, that they're without in-class support, they're handling disciplinary issues that are really just disrupting their ability to teach. So there's a Republican slant to the way he's saying it, but also there's a real ground truth in that, teachers are stressed and they're overworked and they feel like they don't have enough support or enough pay.
Yeah, and I follow all the climate surveys that, over the past couple of years, and that is the thing. I would like to teach. I would like to focus on my kids, not these other different subjects and topics where I'm not the expert at. I'm an expert at teaching math.
So moving on, we've got Democratic candidate Jerry Jones. Again, this is a very close race, and Jones could easily find himself in the top 3, depending on how these, as of yet, uncounted ballots shake out. And he basically told our friends over Port City Daily that. He said, look, this race is very much ongoing. He still feels like he's very much in the mix. And I feel like that's pretty accurate. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we'll really know how that lands until November 14th, next week. I will say he's the only black candidate running this year for school board. We had a little bit more diverse panel 2 years ago. But I know for people who would like to see the currently all-white board be a bit more diverse, that they have sort of pinned their hopes on him. All right, so further down in the vote results, again, provisional vote results, we've got Republicans Nikki Bascom and Natasha Tu. As we said at the top of the show, it is technically possible if all of these uncounted ballots are allowed to go through. That means all the provisional ballots are approved and all of the mail-in ballots all go Republican. Everything's Republican, every last vote. Natasha Tu could make it into the top 3. Statistically, that's very unlikely. Nikki Bascom is a little closer.
And, she talked about not wanting to do political games. She ran as a Republican.
Yeah, and she has voiced her frustration with the partisan lens through which a lot of things in the school board are seen. That kind of, it feels like a fair complaint, but it is what it is. These are partisan boards. That's not always been the case historically. It's really hard to ignore the fact that school board is a partisan issue in New Hanover County. And
it's been a flashpoint in the community, the school boards, and that's across the country. That's where the political fights have been playing out.
And we've seen criticisms from the right and the left that Nikki Bascom has not been really transparent about how far right she is, what kind of Republican she is, as opposed to someone like Natasha Tu, who is very direct, and it's been off-putting for some voters, obviously not all voters, but there's no question about where Tu stands on certain issues. I've seen criticisms from, for example, the New Hanover Educational Justice Group and from the Cape Fear Beacon, which is a right-wing publication, both saying, hey, we don't actually feel like we know what this candidate is standing for. All right, well, that wraps up our candidates. I'll say it one more time for the cheap seats. We just don't know, guys. We are as eager to get those final votes tallied and reported as you are, but we got to wait for next week. But for now, Rachel Keith, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
All right, well, that's just about all the time we have for this edition of the Newsroom. Thank you very much to Johanna Still from the Assembly and, of course, my colleagues Nikolai Mather, Kelly Kenoyer, and Rachel Keith. Thanks as well to WHQR's Ken Campbell, as always, for technical support. If you missed any part of this show, you can find it at WHQR.org or find it as a podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. If you've got questions or comments or an idea for a future show, you can reach us at newsroom@WHQR.org. I'm Ben Schachman. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us for the next edition of The Newsroom.